The Bennett farm slowly came back to life. Golden rows of corn swayed gently in the autumn breeze. The repaired fences stood strong, and the horses grazed peacefully in the pasture. Every sunrise brought Clara a little more hope that she could finally keep the promise she had made to her late husband, to protect the home they had built together. But while the farm was healing, danger was drawing closer. Silas Crow watched every improvement with growing frustration. "The woman should have left weeks ago," he growled as he paced inside his office. One of his hired men leaned against the wall. "That Apache has ruined everything." Crow slammed his fist onto the desk. "Then we'll make him regret it." A few days later, Clara received notice that the county judge would hear her case regarding the debt. If she could prove that Crow had illegally damaged her property and manipulated the loan agreement, she might save the farm permanently. "I have to go," she told Taza. He nodded. "You should. I'm worried about leaving Eli. I'll watch him." Clara smiled with relief. "I trust you." Those three simple words stayed with Taza long after she rode toward town. The morning passed quietly. Eli helped gather firewood before asking, "Can I go fishing at the creek?" Taza looked toward the nearby stream. "Stay where I can see you." "I will." The boy grabbed his fishing pole and ran happily toward the water. For nearly an hour, everything remained peaceful. Then one of the horses in the pasture suddenly lifted its head and snorted. Taza immediately noticed. The horses had sensed something. He climbed onto the fence and scanned the valley. Dust rose behind a cluster of cottonwood trees. 3 riders, moving fast. His instincts sharpened. "Jacob," he shouted to one of the ranch hands, "take the women into the barn." Without another word, Taza sprinted toward the creek, but he was seconds too late. Eli's fishing pole lay abandoned on the riverbank. The boy was gone. Only deep hoofprints remained in the damp soil. Jacob rode up beside him. "What happened?" "They took Eli." "Who?" Taza knelt beside the tracks. 3 horses. One carried extra weight. The kidnappers hadn't tried to hide their trail. They want us to follow. Jacob reached for his rifle. "We'll gather every man we can." Taza stood. "No." "What?" "Too many riders will frighten them." "So you want to go alone?" "They're using the boy as bait." Jacob hesitated. "They could kill you." "They could." Taza mounted his horse. "But they won't keep Eli." Following the tracks through rocky hills, Taza relied on skills his grandfather had taught him as a child. Broken branches, fresh hoofprints, a torn piece of Eli's blue shirt caught on a thorn bush. The boy had left signs. He knew Taza would come. As evening settled over the mountains, Taza spotted smoke rising from a narrow canyon. He dismounted and quietly climbed onto a rocky ledge overlooking the camp. 3 outlaws sat around a fire. Eli was tied beside a wagon, frightened but unharmed. Nearby stood the gang's leader. "We'll send Crow a message," one outlaw laughed. "The woman will sign over the farm before sunrise." Another kicked dirt into the fire. "If she refuses, we leave the boy in the mountains." Taza's eyes hardened. There would be no negotiations. Darkness covered the canyon. Using the wind to hide his steps, Taza crouched lower and moved closer. Movements. Taza slipped silently between the rocks. He untied one of the outlaw's horses first. The startled animal bolted through the camp, knocking over supplies. "What was that?" someone shouted. The second horse panicked. Within seconds, chaos spread. While the outlaws chased the frightened animals, Taza reached the wagon. "Eli," he whispered. The boy looked up. "I knew you'd come." Taza cut the ropes around his wrists. "Stay behind me." Before they could leave, one outlaw turned. "There!" Gunfire echoed across the canyon. Bullets struck the rocks, sending chips of stone into the air. Taza pushed Eli behind a boulder. "Stay down." The outlaw charged with a revolver raised. Before he could fire again, Taza knocked the weapon from his hand and threw him into the dirt. Another attacker rushed forward, swinging a rifle like a club. Taza stepped aside and disarmed him with a single powerful movement. The third outlaw saw the fight turning against them. "We're leaving!" The men scrambled onto their remaining horses and disappeared into the darkness. Taza didn't chase them. Saving Eli mattered more than revenge. As silence returned, Eli wrapped his arms tightly around Taza. "I wasn't scared after a while. No, I knew you'd find me." Taza smiled for the first time that night. "I gave your mother my word." When they returned to the ranch just before dawn, Clara was already there. The court hearing had ended early after she learned Eli was missing. The moment she saw her son riding safely behind Taza, tears streamed down her face. She rushed forward and embraced Eli with all her strength. Then she looked at Taza. "You saved my son. Brave." Clara's voice trembled. "You could have been killed." Taza answered quietly. "No child should ever pay for another person's greed." Clara looked into his calm, steady eyes and realized something had changed. The man she had once known only as a quiet rancher had become the person she trusted most in the world. And though neither of them spoke the words aloud, both knew that the bond between their hearts had grown stronger than ever before. 3 mornings later, Taza saddled his strongest horse before the sun had fully risen. He told no one where he was going except his oldest ranch hand. "If I'm not back by dark," he said, "keep the ranch running as usual." The ranch hand nodded. "You're going to Clara's farm again, aren't you?" Taza answered only with a quiet glance, before riding toward the distant hills. When he reached the Bennett farm, the damage was worse than before. Several fence rails had been pulled apart. The vegetable garden had been trampled, and 2 of the remaining cattle were missing. The empty pasture stretched across the prairie, like a wound that had been left untended for too long. Taza dismounted and carefully examined the ground. Fresh hoofprints circled the barn. Wagon tracks led toward the main road. This had happened only hours earlier. He followed the tracks until they disappeared near a neighboring ranch owned by an elderly couple, Samuel and Martha Green. They welcomed him onto their porch with worried faces. "We were hoping someone would come," Martha said. "You saw something?" Taza asked. Samuel nodded grimly. 3 riders drove cattle away from Clara's place last night. "Did they wear masks?" "Yes." "Could you recognize any of their horses?" Samuel hesitated. One carried Silas Crow's brand. Taza's suspicions hardened into certainty. Crow wasn't waiting for the law to take Clara's land. He was destroying the farm piece by piece so she would have nothing left worth saving. That evening, Taza returned to the ranch and called his workers together. Clara noticed the serious look on his face. "What happened?" she asked. He met her eyes. "Your farm has been sabotaged." She felt the color drain from her face. "My cattle?" she asked. "Gone," he said. "The fences?" "Broken." For a long moment she couldn't speak. Everything she and Thomas had worked for seemed to be slipping away. "I've already lost," she whispered. Taza shook his head. "No." She looked at him with tired eyes. "How can you say that?" she asked. "Because your farm still has one thing." "What?" "You." Clara frowned. "I don't understand. As long as the owner hasn't given up, the farm isn't lost." Those words settled deeply into her heart. The next morning, something unexpected happened. Before sunrise, wagons began arriving at Taza's ranch. One carried lumber. Another brought sacks of seed. A blacksmith unloaded new tools. Several neighboring ranchers climbed down from their wagons, greeting Taza with firm handshakes. Clara stared in confusion. "What's happening?" she asked. Taza simply smiled. "We're going to rebuild your farm." "Us?" "All of us." She blinked in disbelief. "But why?" An older rancher laughed warmly. Because Taza once helped every one of us. Another woman stepped forward. When my husband broke his leg, he harvested our fields before winter. A third man nodded. He never asked for payment. He just said neighbors should help neighbors. Clara looked at Taza with new understanding. The quiet Apache rancher had spent years earning respect through kindness instead of words. Now those acts were returning to him. By midday, more than 20 people were working on the Bennett farm. Some repaired fences, others replaced broken roof boards. Children gathered loose stones from the fields, while women cleaned the neglected farmhouse. The sound of hammers echoed across the valley. For the first time in months, the farm felt alive again. Clara worked beside everyone else, refusing to rest. She carried lumber, planted late vegetables, and thanked every volunteer personally. When she paused to catch her breath, Martha Green squeezed her shoulder. "You don't have to thank us." "Yes, I do." "No," Martha smiled. "One day you'll help someone else." Eli ran happily across the pasture, carrying a bucket of nails. Taza looked up from repairing a fence. "The apple tree still lives." The boy pointed toward the edge of the yard. Despite months of neglect, the old tree still held a handful of green leaves. Taza walked over and rested a hand against its rough bark. "It has strong roots." Eli grinned. "Like Mama?" Taza smiled. "Yes. Can it grow again?" "If it's cared for." The boy looked toward his mother. "So can people." Taza nodded quietly. "So can people." For nearly a week, the work continued. The fields were cleared. The barn roof no longer leaked. Fresh fencing surrounded the pasture. Even the small farmhouse looked brighter, after new windows and a coat of white paint. Hope slowly replaced despair. But not everyone welcomed the changes. From a distant ridge overlooking the valley, Silas Crow watched through a spyglass. His face twisted with anger. "They were supposed to leave," he muttered. One of his hired men shifted uneasily. "What now?" Crow lowered the spyglass. "If the farm survives until harvest." He clenched his jaw. "I lose everything." The outlaw frowned. "So, what do you want us to do?" Crow's eyes narrowed coldly. "Make sure the harvest never comes." As the sun set over the repaired fields, Clara stood beside Taza, grateful for the miracle unfolding before her. She believed the worst was finally behind them. Neither of them knew that Crow had already begun planning a far more dangerous attack. One that would threaten not just the farm, but the lives of everyone fighting to keep it alive. Save it. P. The rooster's crow echoed across the ranch, long before sunrise. Clara was already awake. She quietly folded the blankets she and Eli had borrowed and climbed down from the hayloft. The stable smelled of fresh straw, leather, and horses. She tied back her hair, rolled up her sleeves, and looked around for something to do before anyone gave her instructions. By the time the first ranch hands arrived, the stalls had been swept, fresh water filled every trough, and feed had been measured for each horse. One of the men stopped in surprise. "You've been working since before dawn?" he asked. Clara simply smiled. "I said I'd earn my place." The ranch hand scratched his beard, clearly impressed. Not many people keep their word like that. Soon Taza entered the stable. His sharp eyes quickly noticed the clean floor, neatly stacked tools, and calm horses eating quietly. "You work hard," he said. Clara nodded. "Hard work is all I have left." Taza gave a slight nod of approval. "Then there'll always be work here." Those simple words eased a burden she had carried for months. As the days passed, Clara settled into life on the ranch. She cleaned the house, mended torn saddle blankets, helped prepare meals for the ranch hands, and learned the routines of caring for the horses. Unlike the other ranches she had visited, no one treated her as a burden. Taza spoke little, but whenever he gave instructions, they were clear and respectful. He never raised his voice, and he expected everyone, including himself, to work just as hard as anyone else. The ranch reflected its owner. Everything was orderly, peaceful, and built with patience instead of haste. Eli quickly found happiness again. One afternoon he wandered toward the horse pens, fascinated by a young gray colt that refused to let anyone come near. The frightened animal tossed its head and kicked at the fence whenever a ranch hand approached. "He's too wild." Eli stepped back obediently. Just then, Taza appeared, carrying a bucket of grain. Instead of forcing the colt into submission, he sat quietly several feet away. He waited. Minutes passed without a word. Slowly, curiosity overcame fear. The colt walked closer. Only when the horse lowered its head did Taza gently offer a handful of grain. Eli watched with wide eyes. "You didn't chase him." Taza smiled faintly. "Fear cannot be beaten away." "What do you mean?" "If something is afraid, force only teaches it to fear you more." He looked at Eli. "Trust takes longer." The boy thought carefully before asking, "Is that why your horses follow you?" Taza nodded. "They choose to." From that day on, Eli spent every spare moment helping around the stables. Under Taza's guidance, he learned how to brush horses, refill water buckets, and understand an animal's body language instead of trying to control it. For the first time since his father's death, laughter returned to the boy's voice. Clara noticed. She often caught Eli smiling in ways she hadn't seen for nearly a year. One evening, after supper, Clara thanked Taza. "I haven't seen my son this happy in a long time." "He misses his father," Taza replied quietly. "So do I." For a moment, neither of them spoke. Loss was something they both understood, without needing many words. As autumn deepened, Clara finally shared the full story of her troubles. "My husband borrowed money after 2 years of failed harvests. He believed one good season would let us repay everything." She stared into the fire. "But he became sick before planting was finished." "The lender?" Taza asked. "Silas Crow." At the mention of the name, Taza's expression hardened, almost imperceptibly. "I know him." Clara looked surprised. "He claims he's only collecting what he's owed." Taza shook his head slowly. "Crow has collected many farms." "What do you mean?" "He lends money to families already struggling. And then? He waits." Clara's heart sank. "When drought comes, or illness, he takes their land." She looked down at her hands. "So it wasn't just us." "No." That same week, Taza rode past Clara's abandoned farm while delivering horses to a nearby settlement. Something immediately caught his attention. The front gate had been torn from its hinges. Fresh wagon tracks crossed the fields. Several fence posts had been deliberately broken. When he inspected the barn, he found footprints that didn't belong there. Someone had been searching the property. The damage wasn't caused by weather. It was intentional. Nearby, an elderly neighbor waved him over. "I've seen riders coming at night," the old man whispered. "They chase off the cattle and cut fences." "Did you recognize them?" The man shook his head. "They hide their faces." Taza studied the broken pasture in silence. This was no random vandalism. Someone wanted the farm to appear abandoned. And worthless. As he mounted his horse to return to the ranch, one thought stayed firmly in his mind. Silas Crow was moving sooner than expected. Taza knew the danger facing Clara had grown far greater than unpaid debt. Someone wasn't simply waiting for her to fail anymore. Someone was making sure she did. Clara Bennett stood at the edge of the dusty road, with one hand gripping her son's small fingers and the other holding the worn leather strap of a faded travel bag. The early autumn wind swept across the prairie, carrying dry leaves and the scent of distant rain, but it brought no comfort. Behind her lay the small farm she and her late husband had struggled to build, a place now hanging by a thread. The cornfields had withered after months of drought, the barn roof leaked, and the few chickens left wandered through broken fences. Worst of all, A notice nailed to her front gate declared that unless her debts were paid within 30 days, the property would belong to someone else. 8-year-old Eli looked up at his mother with tired blue eyes. "Where are we going now, Mama?" Clara forced a smile, though her heart felt heavier than ever. "We're going to find work," she answered softly. "As long as we keep moving, we'll find someone who needs an honest pair of hands." Since her husband Thomas had died from a fever the previous winter, every burden had fallen upon Clara's shoulders. She had planted alone, harvested alone, repaired fences alone, and hidden every tear from her son. The money Thomas had borrowed to survive the previous drought now belonged to a wealthy land speculator who seemed far more interested in taking the farm than collecting fair payment. Many neighbors offered sympathy, but little else. Everyone struggled to survive, and few could afford another mouth to feed. Still, Clara refused to beg. By midday, she and Eli had stopped at 3 ranches. At each one she offered the same proposal. "I can cook, clean, mend clothes, milk cows, or help in the fields. I only ask for enough wages to feed my son." Each answer was the same. "We've already hired hands. We can't spare the food. Try somewhere else." With every refusal, Eli became quieter. As the afternoon sun lowered across the hills, Clara spotted a ranch unlike the others. It sat farther from town, surrounded by rolling grasslands where dozens of horses grazed peacefully. The fences were sturdy, the barns well cared for, and riders moved silently among the animals with remarkable skill. She recognized the place immediately. People in town called it the Apache Ranch. Its owner was a man named Taza. Some spoke of him with respect, saying he was the finest horse trainer for 100 miles. Others whispered old stories filled with suspicion simply because he was Apache. Clara had learned long ago that fear often created stories far larger than the truth. She looked down at Eli. "Remember your manners." He nodded. They walked slowly toward the ranch house. Several ranch hands stopped working as the strangers approached. Their curious eyes followed Clara's worn dress, patched boots, and Eli's thin frame. One of the workers stepped forward. "What do you want?" "I'm looking for work," Clara answered calmly. Before the man could respond, another figure emerged from the stable. Tall and broad-shouldered, Taza moved with quiet confidence. His dark hair rested against his shoulders, and his calm eyes studied Clara without judgment. Dust covered his boots from a long morning of work with the horses. He said nothing at first. Instead, he noticed the little details others ignored. The blistered hands that belonged to someone accustomed to hard labor. The careful way Clara stood slightly ahead of Eli, shielding him. The exhaustion she tried so hard to hide. Finally he spoke. "What kind of work can you do?" "Anything honest." His eyes remained steady. "And if I have no room in the house?" Clara lifted her chin. "I'll sleep in the barn and ask nothing else." The ranch hands exchanged surprised glances. Few people would speak with such dignity while standing on the edge of desperation. She continued quietly. "I don't want charity. Let me earn my keep. Give my boy one good meal each day, and I'll work from sunrise until dark." Silence settled over the yard. Eli squeezed his mother's hand, but said nothing. Taza looked toward the fading sky before returning his gaze to Clara. "You'll work in the stables first," he said. "If your work matches your words, we'll discuss the rest later." Relief washed across Clara's face, though she fought to hide it. "Thank you." One of the ranch hands frowned. "Boss, are you sure? We don't know these people." Taza answered without raising his voice. "I know enough." He handed Clara a lantern. "The loft above the stable is clean. There's fresh hay and blankets." Clara nodded gratefully. "That's more than we expected." That evening, Eli fell asleep almost immediately on the soft hay, after eating the first warm meal he had enjoyed in days. Clara remained awake near the open barn door, watching the stars slowly brighten above the prairie. For the first time in weeks, she felt a small spark of hope. She did not notice the 3 riders standing on a distant ridge, overlooking her abandoned farm. Hidden by the darkness, they studied the empty buildings, before turning their horses away. Someone was waiting for Clara to give up her land. But they had not counted on the quiet Apache rancher, who had just opened his gate to a determined widow and her son. The rescue of Eli spread through the valley faster than the morning wind. By the time the sun climbed above the hills, nearly everyone in town had heard that Taza had tracked 3 kidnappers alone through the mountains, and brought the boy home without taking a life. Even those who had once avoided the Apache rancher began speaking of him with respect. For Clara, however, the story was not about bravery. It was about gratitude. She stood outside the farmhouse that evening, watching Taza repair a loose fence rail, as though nothing extraordinary had happened. "You should be resting," she said. Without looking up, he smiled faintly. "Fences don't repair themselves." Clara folded her arms. "And heroes?" He chuckled softly. "They still have work to do." For the first time in many months, Clara laughed. It was a warm, genuine laugh that surprised even her. Eli looked up from feeding the chickens and grinned. "There it is," he said. Clara blinked. "What?" "Your happy laugh." She knelt and hugged her son. "I didn't know you'd missed it." "I did." Taza quietly stepped away, giving them a moment together. But the sound of that laughter stayed with him. As the days passed, life settled into a peaceful rhythm. Clara baked fresh bread each morning, while Eli helped gather eggs and water the garden. Taza spent long hours preparing the fields for harvest, and in the evenings, the 3 of them often shared supper beneath the wide prairie sky. One evening, Eli excused himself to chase fireflies near the apple tree. For the first time, Clara and Taza sat alone. The silence between them felt comfortable rather than awkward. Finally, Clara spoke. "I never thanked you properly." "You already have." "No." She looked toward the fading sunset. "You saved my son's life." Taza remained quiet. After a long pause, he said, "Years ago, no one could save my family." Clara turned toward him. He rarely spoke about himself. "My village was caught in a battle that should never have happened," he continued quietly. "When it ended, I was the only one left. I'm so sorry. I spent many years believing it was easier to live alone." His eyes rested on the distant mountains. "You cannot lose anyone." Clara understood that pain. "When Thomas died," she admitted softly, "I thought my heart had died with him." Neither of them spoke again for several minutes. Sometimes grief needed no answers, only someone willing to understand it. The following week, harvest began. Neighbors arrived with wagons, horses, and smiling faces. Fields that once seemed hopeless now shimmered with golden grain. Everyone worked together from sunrise until dusk. Children carried baskets of vegetables. Women prepared meals beneath the shade of large cottonwood trees. Men stacked hay and loaded wagons until the barns slowly filled. Watching from the porch, Clara whispered, "I never imagined this." Martha Green smiled beside her. Hope grows faster than weeds when enough hands tend it. Clara looked across the field. Taza was helping Eli drive a wagon, patiently teaching the boy how to guide the horses. She noticed how naturally they laughed together. For a brief moment, they looked like father and son. The thought filled her heart with both joy and fear. Joy because Eli needed someone to look up to. Fear because loving someone again meant risking another heartbreaking loss. But Silas Crow had not given up. Hidden inside an abandoned shed overlooking the farm, he met with the 2 outlaws who had escaped the canyon. "You failed," Crow snapped. "The Apache wasn't supposed to survive." One outlaw rubbed his bruised jaw. "He's faster than anyone I've ever fought." Crow slammed a lantern onto a table. "I don't care." He spread a rough map of the Bennett farm before them. "If I can't steal the land..." He pointed toward the large barn filled with freshly harvested grain. "I'll destroy it." The men exchanged uneasy glances. "You mean burn everything?" Crow nodded. "One fire, no crops, no money, no farm, and they'll have nothing left." That same evening, as the harvest celebration began, music drifted across the fields. Families danced beneath strings of lanterns, while children laughed and chased one another through the grass. Clara stood beside Taza, watching the joyful scene. "I haven't seen this valley this happy in years," she said. "People needed a reason to believe again," Taza replied. She looked at him warmly. "No," he raised an eyebrow. "They needed someone willing to believe first." Before Taza could answer, Eli ran toward them carrying 3 cups of fresh cider. "To family," the boy declared proudly. Clara and Taza exchanged surprised glances. Neither corrected him. They gently clinked their cups together. Yet beyond the circle of lantern light, hidden in the darkness, at the edge of the fields, Silas Crow watched the celebration with cold determination. His hand tightened around a burning torch. Before dawn, he intended to turn the Bennett farm into ashes. The greatest test of their courage, and of the love quietly growing between Clara and Taza, was only hours away. The harvest celebration continued long after the stars filled the night sky. Music drifted across the fields as neighbors laughed, children played beneath the lanterns, and wagons loaded with fresh grain stood beside the newly repaired barn. For the first time in over a year, Clara allowed herself to believe that life was finally turning in her favor. Then Eli pointed toward the far end of the pasture. "Mama," she followed his trembling finger. A thin ribbon of smoke curled into the night. Moments later, bright orange flames burst from a stack of hay beside the barn. "Fire!" someone shouted. Panic spread across the farm. Men grabbed buckets, while women hurried the children away from the buildings. Horses whinnied in terror, pulling against their ropes as sparks drifted through the dry autumn air. Taza reacted without hesitation. "Move the horses," he called. Several ranch hands rushed to open the gates, while Taza ran toward the burning haystack. As he reached the barn, he noticed a shadow slipping behind the building. It wasn't an accident. Someone had started the fire. "Taza!" Clara cried. "Stay back!" Ignoring the smoke, he raced around the corner just in time to see Silas Crow holding a burning torch. Crow sneered. "If I can't own this farm, no one will." He threw the torch toward a pile of dry wood. The flames leaped higher. Taza lunged forward, knocking the torch aside before it could ignite the barn wall. Crow swung a heavy wooden club. Taza blocked the blow with his forearm and pushed him backward into the dirt. The 2 men struggled fiercely as smoke swirled around them. Crow reached for a revolver hidden beneath his coat. Before he could raise it, Eli shouted from across the yard, "Look out!" Taza turned just in time to knock the weapon from Crow's hand. The revolver skidded across the ground. By then, several neighbors had arrived. Sheriff Daniel Brooks, who had been attending the harvest celebration, stepped forward with 2 deputies. "That's enough." Crow froze. The sheriff picked up the revolver and looked toward the burning torch lying beside the hay. "I've seen all I need." Crow tried to protest. "This farm belongs to me." "No," the sheriff answered firmly. "It never did." The deputies placed Crow in handcuffs. One of the outlaws who had helped him attempt the kidnapping lowered his head in defeat. "Tell the truth," he admitted. "Crow paid us to destroy the farm, and to kidnap the boy." The crowd fell silent. Every lie, every act of sabotage, and every crime was finally exposed. By sunrise, the fire had been completely extinguished. Thanks to the quick work of the neighbors, only 1 haystack had been lost. The barn, the harvest, and the farmhouse still stood proudly beneath the morning light. Several weeks later, the county judge officially dismissed Clara's debt, after evidence proved Crow had manipulated the loan agreement through fraud and intimidation. The Bennett farm legally belonged to Clara once again. When the judge handed her the final deed, tears filled her eyes. "This is yours," he said with a smile. "No one will take it from you again." Autumn slowly gave way to early winter. The successful harvest provided enough money not only to save the farm, but also to repair every remaining building. Neighbors continued visiting often, no longer divided by old fears and misunderstandings. Many who had once judged Taza simply because he was Apache now thanked him openly for his courage and generosity. Respect had replaced prejudice. One snowy afternoon, Eli helped Taza repair a wooden fence near the apple tree that had survived every hardship. The boy looked up with a thoughtful expression. "Can I ask you something?" "Of course. Are you leaving now that everything is fixed?" Taza smiled gently. "I hadn't planned on it." Eli's face brightened. "Good." He hesitated before speaking again. "Once again, if you'd stay forever." Taza looked toward the farmhouse, where Clara stood watching them from the porch. "I think," he answered quietly, "that depends on your mother." That evening, Clara invited Taza to supper. After Eli had fallen asleep, they sat together beside the fireplace. The room was peaceful, except for the soft crackling of the flames. Clara looked at the man who had entered her life when she had nothing left to offer, except hard work and hope. "When I first came here," she said softly, "I asked only for a place to sleep in the barn." Taza nodded. "I remember. I thought I had lost everything." She reached across the table and gently took his hand. But instead, she smiled through grateful tears. "I found someone who saved my farm, protected my son, and quietly healed my heart." For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Words were no longer necessary. Outside, snow began to fall across the peaceful valley, covering the fields in white. Inside the warm farmhouse, Clara, Eli, and Taza shared the beginning of a new chapter, not built on fear or loss, but on trust, kindness, and love. The little farm that had once stood on the edge of ruin had become something far greater than a place to live. It had become a home, and for the first time in many years, every heart beneath its roof looked toward the future with hope.